This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one country, one leader, or one decision. This is about a quiet redesign of power, because something fundamental has shifted and most people missed it. Force didn't disappear. It was replaced. What used to arrive with uniforms and aircraft now arrives with contracts, engineers, and spreadsheets. No explosions. No invasion footage. Just a system that decides who eats, who sells, and who survives. You are told this is cooperation. You are told this is stability. But underneath that language is a mechanism that doesn't punish resistance. It simply makes resistance unaffordable. And once a system reaches that point, it no longer needs to threaten. It only needs to wait. Stay with me. Because what looks like de-escalation here is actually consolidation. The pressure hasn't been released. It's been rerouted. And to understand how that happens, you first have to stop looking at people and start looking at what actually controls the system now. What actually governs this system now is not ideology, not elections, not even military dominance. It's dependency. Control no longer comes from what you can destroy. It comes from what you can turn off. Revenue streams, supply chains, access points. When a country's survival is wired into infrastructure it does not own, power becomes invisible. And invisible power is the hardest to resist. This is why the conversation quietly moved away from confrontation and toward normalization. Because normalization doesn't mean equality. It means alignment on someone else's terms. Once an economy is rebuilt around external capital, external technology, and external markets, policy becomes conditional by design. Not enforced by tanks, enforced by math. If you comply, the system hums. If you don't, it stalls. And the brilliance of this structure is that no one has to issue an order. The consequences enforce themselves. That's the frame you have to hold in your head. Because what comes next looks like compromise. But it's actually the moment the lock clicks into place, and that lock wasn't installed overnight. It was built slowly while everyone was told things were improving. What made this shift so effective is how long it took, because nothing dramatic happened all at once. No declaration, no line in the sand. Before, pressure was loud. Sanctions announced, threats delivered, deadlines imposed. Now, pressure is ambient. Before, leverage was episodic. It spiked during crises, then it faded. Now, leverage is continuous. The system didn't change direction. It changed tempo. Slow changes don't trigger alarms. They get normalized. They get explained away as pragmatism, as realism, as progress. Each small adjustment felt reasonable on its own. A permit here, a release there, a meeting framed as technical. But stacked together, those adjustments rewired the baseline. What used to be optional became necessary. What used to be sovereign became conditional. And the most dangerous part? By the time dependency becomes visible, it's already irreversible. Because the system no longer asks for obedience. It assumes it. That's why the first real shock didn't come as a threat. It came disguised as relief. And once you see that moment clearly, you start to understand why the next crisis was inevitable. The first visible jolt didn't arrive as violence. It arrived as a gesture. Doors opened, people walked free, families reunited. You were told this was a breakthrough, a humanitarian turn. Proof that pressure had worked. But look closer. Those releases weren't an ending. They were a payment, because in this system, freedom is no longer a right. It's a bargaining chip. The timing mattered. The sequencing mattered. Nothing moved until a condition was met. And once it was, the system responded not with trust, but with access. Talks resumed, doors reopened, capital leaned forward. That's how you know this wasn't reconciliation. It was clearance, a box checked, a gate unlocked, and the most unsettling part is how clean it looked. No chaos, No confrontation, just a quiet exchange that signaled something much larger. Compliance had become measurable. If you want to understand how power operates now, don't watch the speeches, watch the transactions, because once people become currency, the system has crossed a line it never walks back from. And that moment right there is where leverage stops being theoretical. Here's what that transaction unlocked. Not goodwill, not trust, mechanics. Because once compliance is demonstrated, the real system activates. Capital moves first. Technology follows. Infrastructure comes last. And whoever controls that sequence controls everything downstream. This is where power stops being visible and starts being permanent. Because infrastructure doesn't argue. Pipelines don't protest. Refineries don't vote. They just decide what flows and what doesn't. When revenue depends on systems you don't own, every future decision is pre-filtered. Every policy choice runs through a silent question. Will this shut us down? That's the hidden mechanism. It rewards alignment automatically, and it punishes deviation without announcing it. You don't need sanctions anymore. You just pause maintenance, delay insurance, reroute shipping, and suddenly the economy feels unstable. No ultimatum is issued. No threat is spoken. The damage arrives as math. This is why this model is so effective. It doesn't force obedience. It makes obedience the cheapest option. And once that logic is embedded, the next crisis doesn't come from outside pressure. It comes from inside the system itself. Then the second shock hits faster. No announcement, no ceremony, just movement. Contracts advance. Timelines compress. Expectations harden. Decisions that used to take years are suddenly framed as urgent, necessary, non-negotiable. Because once infrastructure is promised, delay becomes dangerous. Deadlines tighten. Risk language shifts. Stability is redefined as speed. And this is where systems break people. Corners get cut. Oversight thins. Dependency deepens before anyone has time to object. What was sold as reconstruction starts behaving like lock-in. Because now the question isn't, should this happen? It's what happens if it stops? And stopping suddenly feels catastrophic. That's how acceleration works. It doesn't escalate pressure. It removes exits. At this stage, even resistance feels reckless. Even dissent sounds irresponsible. Not because it's wrong, but because the system has been tuned to punish hesitation. This is the moment when control stops looking imposed and starts feeling inevitable. And once inevitability takes hold, the consequences are no longer theoretical. They become personal. This is where it reaches you, not as policy, not as theory, as constraint, because when systems like this lock in, they don't announce themselves to the public. They show up as limits in your life. Jobs tied to a single revenue stream. Prices that move without explanation. Services that work until they don't. You're told it's temporary. You're told it's technical. You're told to be patient. But patience becomes a condition of survival. When an economy is wired this tightly, ordinary people absorb the shock first. Not leaders. Not executives. You do. And the cruel efficiency of this model is that it never has to target you directly. It just rearranges incentives until choices disappear. If you comply, things function. If you question, things slow. If you resist, things break. That's not repression in the old sense. It's management. And once daily life depends on alignment, politics stops being a debate. It becomes a risk calculation. So if this feels abstract, it shouldn't, because systems like this don't stay contained. They spread by example. And the question you should be asking now isn't who is doing this, but where else this logic is already being installed. Once that logic proves it works, it doesn't stay local. It travels because systems like this are scalable, portable, attractive to anyone who wants control without confrontation. What begins as a special case quietly becomes a template, exported through contracts, copied through policy memos, justified through language about stability and efficiency, and the ripple isn't measured in borders. It's measured in alignment. Markets adjust. Allies recalibrate. Institutions start asking the same question everywhere: who controls the switch? When energy, finance, and logistics move together, geography stops protecting anyone. Distance doesn't matter. Neutrality doesn't matter. What matters is whether your system plugs into theirs or depends on it. And once multiple economies are wired into the same nodes, a disruption in one place doesn't stay contained. It cascades. Quietly, predictably, that's when uncertainty replaces autonomy. Because now no one is fully in control, but everyone is exposed. And the most unsettling part is that this spread doesn't require agreement. It only requires participation. By the time the pattern is obvious, it's already embedded, which brings us to the future not as a prediction, but as a narrowing set of options. From here, the future doesn't branch into hope or collapse. It narrows. There are three paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. The system holds. Dependencies are accepted. Stability is maintained by constant alignment. Nothing explodes, but nothing is truly autonomous again. The second is erosion. Small failures compound. Maintenance lags. Trust thins. Control remains, but at higher cost, with more friction, more resentment, more internal strain. And then there's rupture. Not sudden, not cinematic. A missed payment, a delayed shipment, a political misstep that triggers a technical response. Flows slow, confidence cracks. The system that enforced compliance now amplifies instability. What matters is that none of these paths involve a return to before. Once survival is conditional, reversal isn't on the menu. And the most dangerous part is that no one gets to choose which path unfolds. They only choose how tightly they cling to the system as it moves. That's the acceleration phase. Not toward resolution, but toward exposure. Because when power stops using force, it doesn't become benign. It becomes patient. And patience in systems like this is never neutral.